So good morning again. I'm Vail Oxford, currently the National Security Advisor at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and a member of the Aspen Institute Homeland Security Group. The next panel is here to talk about transportation security using a risk-based approach, and we'll examine the threat to the aviation sector and how TSA, under John Pistole, is responding to these threats with a risk-based approach as opposed to the post-9/11 one-size-fits-all approach. It will be moderated by Catherine Herridge, Chief Intelligence Correspondent for Fox News. Catherine was the first network TV correspondent assigned to the Homeland Security beat in 2001. And she was one of the first reporters to sit in the same military courtroom as the self-described architect of the September 11th attack, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his four co-conspirators, and she now covers intelligence, the Justice Department, and the Department of Homeland Security. The floor is yours, Catherine.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you for being here and for being invested in our nation's security. I'd just like to thank Clark for having the vision for this conference. Also, Walter Isaacson for graciously hosting us here at the Aspen Institute. And I am thrilled and honored to be moderating this panel this year with the TSA Administrator, John Pistole. Congratulations on your nearly 31 years of government service. 27 at the Bureau, 6 as a Deputy Director.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
And now 4 as the head of the TSA. You are now the longest-serving administrator. Is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Well, congratulations.
I'm still looking for anybody who wants to swap jobs for a day, week, month, or a year. I have different options available. So yeah.
That will be on Twitter afterwards.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
It's not news to anyone who's been to this forum. What we all understand now is that Al-Qaeda has metastasized. And it's unfortunately been highly successful in spreading its hateful message. And with that success, they've been able to build a new body of recruits. In other words, they have more manpower at their disposal. And one of the things we've seen happen in the last 2 years, and especially the last year, is that the group in Yemen, this was the group that was behind the underwear bomb that nearly brought down the plane on Christmas Day 2009, their bomb maker, who is an expert with non-metallic explosives, has been training new apprentices. And they have been sharing their expertise with non-metallic explosives, or what I would call the terrorist playbook for best practices, with other areas: North Africa, Libya, East Africa, Somalia, and now most significantly, Syria, where there are a wealth of foreign fighters carrying Western passports that allow them to travel to the United States without visas. So they are the perfect mules for these devices. And I'm honored to be hosting this panel because of all of the agencies, the TSA is really at the tip of the spear of this threat. And earlier this week, John, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, said that the threat is very real. Do you believe the threat to aviation security is greater today than it was 4 years ago when you became administrator?
Yeah, and let me start off by also thanking Clark and Walter and all those people who put on the Aspen Security Forum here, because it's almost like an extended family reunion for me. This is my 4th year to be privileged to participate, and so it's so good to be here. I think it is more pervasive, more systemic from the standpoint of we know about al-Siri, we know and just assume, let's say we don't know, but we just need to assume that he has trained others. I think if we assume otherwise, then we're deluding ourselves. So using that construct that there is at least one and probably many more people capable of constructing the non-metallic IED that we saw on Christmas Day and then a couple years ago now, and being able to construct cargo bombs like we saw in October 2010, that is, I see as a clear and present danger that has not been mitigated to our satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about how the TSA has become an intelligence-driven operation. So let's do a real-world example. When MH17 was shot down over the Ukraine, how quickly did you know that it was a missile versus a bomb on board the aircraft, and where did that intelligence come from?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and construct, but it was probably around the same time as everybody else in terms of, obviously, we're looking at the speculation. Of course, you know, what happened. My first concern was that there was somebody on board, a suicide bomber on board, that had taken it down. And so it's simply a matter of trying to look at the possible opportunities, whether man-made cause or something mechanical or something else.
But you knew within, based on your briefings.
Well, yeah, so I knew shortly, but in terms of knowing it was a missile and where it was fired from, that came later. As people were developing the information, intelligence about it.
TSA is now risk-based. So how would you define the risk, and what would you give us as the top 3 that you choose to mitigate?
Well, clearly from a U.S. aviation perspective, the non-metallic IED is our top threat. So we have great confidence that there are no little or few, if any, shouldn't be any, for example, shouldered missile rockets, man-pads here in the U.S., where TSA provides security at almost 450 airports. There's good control. There's no information about those being in renegade hands or terrorist hands or things like that. The concern is with the hundreds of airports that have nonstop passenger service to the U.S. and cargo service, that the perimeter security, because that's where it really becomes important for the man-pads, not all have done a vulnerability assessment of what goes beyond the perimeter. And so, for example, here in the U.S., at all the major airports, what we call the Cat X airports, the largest, 28, and then the Cat 1s, the next size down, over 100 of those, there has been a vulnerability assessment done of if somebody did acquire a man-pad, where would they want to position themselves to try to take down either approaching or plane taking off. And so that, for large airports, that's done with the FBI on a joint vulnerability assessment.
So non-metallic explosives first, then man-pads.
Well,
second,
man-pads overseas.
Overseas,
so
okay.
not in the U.S. It would be some other type. So I would, for the U.S., if we're delineating between U.S. and overseas, non-metallic IED, person-borne bomb.
Okay.
The second in the U.S. would be somebody being able to put explosives in a checked bag on a commercial airliner here in the U.S. I mean, there's 27,000 flights every day that take off in the U.S., so it's a lot of security for that. The third then would be cargo, either cargo that is going in the belly of a commercial airliner or on an all-cargo flight, such as FedEx, UPS, which we saw going back to the Yemen cargo plot. Again, the toner cartridge is back from October 10.
And where do liquid explosives fit?
Well, so liquids would be a non-metallic IED,
Okay.
sure. So, you know, if it's the whole notion is, if somebody could go through a walk-through metal detector, such as Abdul Muttalib did on Christmas Day 2009 in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, and a couple airports prior to that in getting to Schiphol, you can go through a walk-through metal detector 100 times, 1,000 times, whether it's the liquids plot, such as out of the UK from August of '06, or this next generation device that we are concerned about.
We've got a very short video clip. Some of you have seen it before, but I think it's worth showing again. What are we going to see in this clip, John? Well,
if it's, and with apologies to those who were here last year in Minnesota, but if it's, this is something that the FBI did after the underwear bomber from 2009, and took the remains of that device that had, of course, burned but not exploded, and did basically a test of the amount of explosives and if also remotely detonated, and it's basically on a sheet of aluminum to replicate the skin of an aircraft, and the explosive power of the explosives that would be not too much different from what's in this glass of water.
Okay, so let's take a look at that clip if we've got it. You and I can probably watch it right here. You know, these terrorists are smart. I had a piece of advice years ago that terrorism is like water. It takes the path of least resistance. And you're dealing with a thinking enemy. You move one way and it moves another. They clearly have seen that we've gone to great lengths to reduce or mitigate the threat from these non-metallic explosives. So do they continue to go down that road, or are they now seeking other avenues? And if they're seeking other avenues, how are you trying to affect policies that get ahead of that?
Yeah, so we're always concerned about what the next attempt will be, the next device. But from everything that I'm aware of, it is still the non-metallic IED, and the fact that we have good mitigation measures in place here in the U.S. Gives me great assurance. But the fact that those 275 last points of departure to the U.S. don't have the same level. They have a baseline level, which we require for anybody who comes to the U.S. But then it's really on the airlines and the airports and the countries themselves to up that. And so for those of you who travel internationally, oftentimes you'll go through a foreign airport, a main checkpoint, and then when you get to the gate for the flight to the U.S., you'll go through additional screening. Well, that's a TSA requirement to make sure that that flight has more security than the other flights that are not coming to the U.S. So the concern is that the threat is emanating from overseas, vice here domestically. But as the first panel mentioned, the homegrown violent extremists concern us, concern me. But given that the overseas to Western Europe or the U.S. being the most pervasive threat, then that's why we have to work so closely with our foreign counterparts to ensure that they are buying down risk in a way that doesn't create 3 and 4 hour checkpoints, either at the main checkpoint or at the gate, and for the carry-on bags and for the cargo.
You know, transportation is a non-linear system, and what that means is that it's only as strong as its weakest link. And when there's failure at that weakest link, the response can be disproportionately large compared to the failure. So am I hearing you say that you believe the weak link here is the boundary outside of the United States and the foreign airports? Like, you've been successful in pushing out that boundary. That would be the positive, but that would be the weak link to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a global economy, and so we want to further the business of America and other countries. And to do that, we may need to make sure that all those links are as strong as possible, because we can only control so much. We can regulate, and if somebody's not complying with our security standards, then we can either fine them if it's something minor, or we can, the ultimate hammer is we can bar them from flying to the U.S., either with passengers or cargo. And so that's when it gets a political attention that would say, yeah, okay, we need to enhance security at fill-in-the-blank airport. But yeah, clearly that's the most significant threat that we deal with and that we're engaged with. So 3 weeks ago, July 7th, there was some reporting about enhanced security measures at certain airports overseas coming to the U.S. So that's a TSA requirement. That's an order that I signed that said, yes, at certain airports you will do certain prescribed things.
We're talking about the powering on the cell phones, right? Looking more extensively for the shoe bombs. Was that directly related to what you would describe as credible intelligence reporting?
Yes.
Okay, now is this part of the continuum from the increase in security we saw in January after Sochi, and then now again in July? Is this a continuous threat stream?
I would characterize it as an ongoing threat that has ebbs and flows, but as more specific, credible intelligence is obtained and we're able to operationalize it, then we make sure that we do that in a way that is as tailored and precise to mitigate or buy down that risk, again, without disrupting the economy in a way that frankly we did at the Yemen cargo plot. We did had an unintended consequence and billions of dollars of additional costs. So yeah, we try to do that.
Would you describe this intelligence as part of an ongoing plot?
I'd just say it's, as the first panel described, is something that, whether it's AQAP, whether it's IS, ISIS and whomever, you could put whatever label on it. I'm not as concerned about the labels and who's doing it, because it may be a new group that comes up with something that may get some, a putative terrorist on a flight. So I'm not as concerned about the characterization of the person or the group as much as their capabilities, their intent, and then one of the concerns, frankly, at some airports is the insider threat. And so how do you buy down that risk? The government may be supportive, the airlines may be supportive, everybody may be supportive, but if there's an insider who perhaps even unwittingly believes they're facilitating a drug shipment, for example, but it's explosives, then that's an additional challenge we have.
How quickly can you act on the intelligence and make concrete changes in the way that we're either screening or limiting cargo? I'm thinking back to the Yemen plot and the cargo printer bombs. Just walk us through that.
Yeah, so that's the beauty of it, being so closely linked to the intel and law enforcement community. I think most people know, start off every day with that classified intel brief to say, as it relates to transportation, what are we seeing overseas, and how does that help inform our judgments and our actions? And so going back to that plot back in October of 2010, that was an active, ongoing plot where 2 packages had been shipped by a young woman from a freight forward in Sana'a, Yemen, destined for Chicago, and the contents described as a computer printer, clothes, books, things like that. I received a call one evening at home and was asked about, do you have information about this plot? And it was the first I'd heard of it. Had not been briefed that morning. And because of outstanding intelligence work overseas, they were able to actually provide the tracking numbers for those 2 parcels. And one was located in the United Arab Emirates and the one was located in the UK. So we were able to action that immediately. I actually gave a verbal order that night to ban all cargo from Yemen coming to the U.S. And the ripple effect of that was significant, but it's simply being informed and then taking the action. So the bottom line is, yes, we can action things immediately.
Seems like the intelligence in this area really comes down to understanding individual operatives and the travel patterns of individual people. And I will tell you, you have a lot of friends in the audience here today who, when I told them I was doing the panel with you, said, you be nice to John. Because what you need to know is that he had me at PreCheck. So.
Okay, so whoever said that, I'd like to see you afterwards, and it'll be TSA PreCheck for life, free. So, it was probably all of you, right? So yeah, just see me afterwards and we'll take care of it.
So for people who are not familiar with PreCheck, what is PreCheck? How does it reflect this intelligence-driven approach? And of the data set that you are able to use, what would you like to incorporate in that you are not?
Yeah, so TSA PreCheck is one of over 20 policies we've changed in the last few years under what we call risk-based security, and RBS, with apologies to the Royal Bank of Scotland, but just that notion of, that's what we just call it internally. So under RBS, under Secretary Napolitano and then Secretary Johnson, strong support and strong bipartisan support, I would say, on the Hill. It's simply an effort to use some common sense and move away from that one-size-fits-all that by necessity TSA was given the mandate to do with extremely limited intelligence, extremely limited technology. It's just a very rudimentary system. Thanks to great developments in technology and intelligence collection and sharing, we're able to move away, to reduce the size of the haystack, to look for that one possible person. I mean, we screen 2 million people a day now during the summer, and when you look at 650 to 700 million people a year, if we can reduce the size of that haystack through a risk-based approach, primarily by people such as you here who may have volunteered to signed up for TSA PreCheck or CBP's Global Entry Program, our sense is we can buy down risk by expediting the physical screening of those people, pilots, flight attendants, active duty, reserve, National Guard, U.S. intelligence community, SCI clearance holders, whole groups of people that we know and trust in some respects. And my experience as an FBI agent for those years was just one of the things that just, so every time I flew, I flew armed. So when I got to TSA, I said, well, how can we differentiate between people? Because we know and trust them. They said, well, we can't. Some people said, well, you can't because anybody can be a terrorist. I said, well, that's true, but for almost 27 years now, I've been getting on a plane with a deadly weapon, and that's because I had these things called FBI credentials. And so so just that notion, let's move away from one size fits all. Let's use intelligence, information that's available, good technology, and then for those who volunteer information about themselves, we can clearly buy down risk in an informed way that allows us to expedite. I mentioned the pilots and flight attendants. They're presumably the most known and trusted on the flight. I mean, they want to get us point A to point B safely, and they do that exceptional job every day. we've actually gone from where we'd be patting them down if there was some alarm or something to an identity-based screening with them. So over 250,000 pilots and flight attendants every day in the U.S. go through identity-based screening. And as long as we can verify in real time that they are who they say, they're in good standing, they didn't get fired last night, then they're not cutting to the front of the line. We're not spending time doing a physical because we've done the intelligence pre-screening. And that's the whole notion of TSA PreCheck and others.
TSA PreCheck, it's a pretty limited data set. I think you would agree. We're talking about date of birth, right? We're your name, and what else is going into that? Gender. And is there anything else?
That's the starting point.
The starting point,
Yeah.
okay. What else is available?
Well, so that's the criteria we need to do our data checks. And of
Right.
course, the first is against terrorist watch list. And then there's an immigration check, and then there's criminal history check.
Okay.
So those are things, just trying to form, as there's a representative of the British government here, the Brits like to refer to the rich picture. We're just trying to fill that out
Right.
as much as we can.
Because I won't say it's a competing system, but Customs and Border Protection has global entry. Global entry has access to a lot more data than PreCheck does. And if I'm correct, I believe they also can do an in-person interview.
Yeah,
US,
so
okay.
yeah, so CBP, and of course they're looking at not just an expedited reentry to the country. They're looking at admissibility issues and then customs issues. And so if somebody has a history of smuggling items and things, that's something they're looking for. I don't want to say I'm not interested in that, but my focus is keeping terrorists
Okay.
off planes. And so I want to be very focused on that. So we actually have slightly different criteria for criminal histories from between TSA and CBP.
It would seem to me in this case that big data is your friend. Right? Right?
Well, it sure can be
Right.
when used properly, as long as the privacy and civil liberty
Right.
issues that there have been challenges, not with TSA as much, but other government agencies, some of whom are going to be
So has the
speaking
NSA
here
had a
later, so.
chilling effect? Do you think a reluctance among the public to provide this information?
No, I don't think so, because there's a defined benefit that people are receiving for providing some fairly limited information, as opposed to the notion, however misinformed it is, that big government, Big Brother is spying on and taking things without authority or permission. So you get a defined benefit. You get to go through expedited physical screening in 118 airports with a dedicated lane, and so that's, I think, it's a whole different construct.
What are the plans to expand PreCheck?
Yeah, so the 118 is about our maximum because it's simply a return on investment for our from a TSA budgetary.
118
airports,
airports.
over 400 dedicated lanes, and so as we get, for example, here at Pitkin County Aspen Airport, it wouldn't make sense to have a TSA PreCheck lane because it's such a small airport. And we couldn't justify staffing it. And just on that, we're actually, we've been trying to provide this effective security, but do it in the most efficient way. And because of some of the efficiencies we've achieved through TSA PreCheck and risk-based security overall, we actually have about 7% fewer TSA employees today than we did a year ago when I spoke here. And yet the wait times are down compared to a year ago, clearly compared to, 5 years ago or whatever.
So what can you tell us about engagement by third parties to try and increase the enrollment in PreCheck, if your goal is to try and sweep out the 99% that you're not interested in?
We've had over 400,000 people, and a number of you here in the room actually signed up for TSA PreCheck. So we're having about 3,500 people a day since we did it just as a pilot program in Indianapolis back in December. We now have, I think, 26 airports on site and nearly 275 off-airport locations where people can go in and sign up. There's not the interview that you mentioned, but you do provide fingerprints. That being said, to really make it a game changer for us, I am very much interested in having third-party private consortiums who people could sign up for them basically at the wholesale level rather than retail. So Catherine Herridge comes in and signs up for TSA PreCheck at one of our existing, that's basically a retail transaction. Some of these third-party consortiums that we've been talking with could do that at the wholesale level to enroll people based on our criteria, our algorithms of what is primarily trying to identify low risk. We'll always be the final arbiter of high risk, but identifying low risk people, and presumably everybody here is low risk. So if they're willing to sign up through a third party that then we have an arrangement with, an agreement with, then they can provide that information, say, here's 1 million people that we have vetted to your standards, and these 999,000 meet your criteria, and so we would pass them as being potential, known, and trusted. We then do the final vetting, and then would move forward in that way.
And who would operate something like that? Would that be banks, credit card companies?
Yeah, there's actually some folks, companies here represented who are part of, there's several consortiums that we've been engaged with in response to a request that we put out last year, actually, and so we've been working through the process, and then I hope to be announcing something this not too distant future about the possibilities.
Okay, so we've talked about the 99% that you're trying to eliminate from that picture. Let's now focus on that 1% that you're really interested in. How are you taking the intelligence and trying to drive policies to effectively screen or block from the United States this 1% that you think has the potential for a terrorist attack?
Yeah, so I think we have a good system here in the U.S. where we will encounter what we call selectees, people who are on the terrorist watch list who are not or classified as no-fly individuals who obviously can't get a boarding pass. But if additional screening is necessary, then they're identified as selectees. And we have good protocols, policies, I believe, to afford that additional screening at all 450 airports. So that's, I have high confidence in that. The challenge then becomes at some of those hundreds of overseas airports, do we have the arrangements in place? Because most of the security firms overseas are private companies that the airlines, perhaps the airports, but usually the airlines hire to do the actual physical screening. So we have to make sure that there's nearly 250,000 people that come to the U.S. every day.
Well, let me just jump in here. What kind of leverage do you have with a non-compliant airport or airline? Because that seems to me like about the only kind of hammer you can drop.
Yeah, so one of TSA's tools is as a regulatory agency. So if somebody, for example, if there's a selectee flying from fill-in-the-blank airport and is not selectee screened, well, first we would learn about that probably before the flight took off.
Let's just take a moment here. This is a very important change that we've seen, I think, which reflects what's happening in Syria, which is the TSA's ability to understand the travel patterns of individuals coming into the United States. So you've got somebody, what areas do you consider high risk that people are traveling out of? And how much do you know about these people 72 hours out from when they're getting on that flight into the United States?
Yeah, so then we get back to the classic situation of knowns and unknowns. So anybody who is a known or suspected terrorist that has been identified and there's sufficient information to either positively identify for a person, then that person, if they make a reservation for a flight to the U.S., then we learn about that 72 hours ahead of time. So every morning in morning intel brief, we have a 72-hour look ahead. So where all the selectees within the U.S. Are flying, even the no-flies who want to fly, not just within the U.S., but even over the U.S. Go over U.S. airspace, which are a fair number, and then some other ones that I won't go into. So that's just.
Well, but those are the interesting ones.
Well, so those are the ones.
Why stop there?
Right. So I would defer to others in the community.
Okay, so that's the group that's coming out of
other places.
The hot spots.
Yeah.
Okay, we're talking about, I'll say it for you. Okay, we're talking about countries. How's that? We're talking about countries where people have easy access into Syria, correct?
There's any number of places.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And I will say, so there's general areas, but then there's sometimes specific intel about somebody coming from an area that you may not generally think of. But that's why. So your question was about our authorities. If we find that somebody, a selectee, and clearly a no-fly, but a selectee has actually been able to board an aircraft overseas en route to the U.S., then we can find that airline. So the airline is a regulated agent, the entity. And so we can do that. And if there's a pattern, then again, we can bar them from bringing passengers or cargo to the U.S.
And how many times or how many incidents have you seen since maybe the beginning of the year where individuals in that category have been stopped from entering the U.S.? How would you ballpark that?
Well,
Dozens?
So it depends. If you're talking about no-flies who are not transiting over the U.S., so for example,
No.
a flight
People that you're stopping coming out of the Middle East, Europe, trying to get to the United States.
Well, so if they're a selectee, they're allowed to fly. They're just provided
That's secondary
enhanced,
screening.
Yeah,
Okay.
secondary screening. So none of those. They would have to be on the no-fly list for us to preclude them with some very limited exceptions that I won't go into.
So what kind of numbers are we talking about now?
Yeah, small. Well, so if you're talking about selectees, there's a number of those who travel within the U.S. and to the U.S. every day.
The Attorney General said recently that there are dozens of investigations on Americans who have traveled to Syria. To the extent you can, how is this type of information shared with the TSA in an effort to either track these people into the United States or to prevent them from coming into the United States?
Yeah, so we work very closely with the Bureau in terms of anybody who has traveled wherever it is, if they've gone to a terrorist training camp or there's something, or they're engaging in conflict. So there's very close coordination. So if there's not sufficient derogatory information to make them a no-fly and they are coming back to the U.S., then there's close coordination on, for example, if it's a U.S. carrier, one of our risk-based strategies, and just to buy down risk, we'll make sure there are federal air marshals, which are part of TSA, of course, on that flight because it's a higher risk flight. So not only are they receiving secondary screening, but there's armed U.S. agents on that flight to make sure that person doesn't do anything. So that's the knowns. It's the unknowns that obviously are the concern.
We've got one slide which is for the non-metallics and what they're being concealed in. Just talk us through, we've got the underwear bomb on the bottom. We've got the radio cassette recorder. That kind of goes back to the 80s, really.
Yeah.
But what's the next wave here? Maybe talk us through the camera example.
Well, so this is just a simplistic depiction that we publish to the aviation community and those in terms of an information bulletin to say, and of course to all of our folks to say, here are some concealment techniques we've seen in the past. Here are some things that cause us pause and concern. And then we train our officers, transportation security officers, to look for these type of devices. And so just, you know.
So what are they looking for?
Yeah, so two things. They're looking for explosives that may be concealed in either, for example, laptop or what electronic may be. But then the second part is either some type of initiator that's electronic or a chemical initiator, such as we saw with the underwear bomb. Something that, so you need the two components to get a bang, and so you have the explosive and the initiator. So our folks are trained to look for both items. Obviously if you find one, you're probably going to find the other. So because of concealment techniques, and they're, basically the folks at the first group we're talking about with Alice and others, they are creative in their design, construction, concealment, and so how can we best detect that and make sure that that doesn't get on a flight either within the U.S. or to the U.S. So again, just a very basic depiction of some of the concealment techniques we've seen historically used and know that could be used.
What we've seen in some of the previous devices is that the detonators have failed. Okay, so what have they learned from their mistakes in terms of improving the efficacy of these devices?
Yeah, that's our concern. They do learn from their mistakes, we believe, and so we have to assume that they've improved either their concealment capabilities or their initiation capabilities.
But have you seen evidence of that? That you can talk about maybe in the plainest unclassified way?
So a little bit, and just what's been out there and what has been mentioned previously in terms of different types of initiators and different types of explosives and things like that. So without going into any detail, yeah, just suffice to say that they are determined, they're adept, and they are continuing trying to improve their tradecraft, including looking at at airports around the world that may or may not have the same detection capabilities that we have here in the U.S.
Are you more concerned that a European who has been in Syria is more likely to try and bring a non-metallic explosive device onto a U.S. aircraft? Or are you more concerned about American citizens based on the numbers?
So it gets back to my earlier point. I'm not as concerned about the group or the individual, based, ethnicity or national origin or things like that. It's who has the ability, and I mean, who would have guessed, going on 5 years ago, that a 24-year-old Nigerian son of a prominent banker who had studied abroad, studied in the UK and all that he would be the next closest successful suicide bomber on a plane. So that's something that it could be anybody, frankly. So the fact that was mentioned, the homegrown violent extremists, the ease of radicalization through the internet, it could be somebody here. I mean, there literally could be somebody here in Aspen who's going to the airport here today with a non-metallic IED. Now that would be, I think, a failure of the U.S. government's entire intelligence law enforcement efforts if that happens, but that may happen, and so we have to be vigilant for that. So it really doesn't matter the ethnicity. We're concerned about Americans, Europeans, who may have, quote, clean passports and things like that, but those are just part of the whole range of options for terrorists to try to exploit.
How close was that 2009 bombing, and why did it fail?
It was very close. The Abdul Muttalib, the bomber, had the device with him for over 2 weeks. And
had he been wearing it for over 2 weeks?
He had it with him for over 2 weeks.
Is that what led to, it was damp? Is that the right word to use? I don't know, like the fuse was bad? I mean,
let's say it was degraded.
It was degraded,
Yeah.
Okay.
Getting
Well,
kind of
thank
personal
goodness
now.
for bad
Yeah,
hygiene, right?
That's
Yes.
right. Let's just say its efficacy was degraded. How's that?
You put that very well.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, smooth. Okay. All right, I'll move on now.
Thank
from
you.
that.
Yeah,
You're welcome. Okay.
Got a drink. Yeah.
One of the themes that I hear from you is that the issue is not the takeover of the aircraft. It's a device that's going to bring down the aircraft. So what does that say about the future of the Marshal Service? The Marshal Service is a service that was designed to deal with the previous attack.
Yeah. So it's the U.S. The Federal Air Marshal Service is a force multiplier for the U.S. and it had a number of other countries that have Federal Air Marshals equivalents on their carriers. And so it's just one of those other layers of security. Because there hasn't been another 9/11 attempt of a hijacking doesn't mean that they won't try it again. The fact that we have reinforced cockpit doors, we have flight crews who are trained in doing things, we have obviously the people on board, like we saw in Flight 93 back on 9/11. There's so many things that have changed that buy down that risk, but shame on us if we're not doing everything we can to prevent something like that from happening again, either on a flight within the U.S. or on a wide-body jet with extra fuel that could be used as a weapon again.
These new procedures, the powering on and off of the cell phones, the additional screening for shoes, how long do you see that staying in place?
Since we are a risk-based, intelligence-driven organization, it's all based on what the latest intelligence tells us. And so what we have to be focused on is how can we, again, mitigate or manage risk without adversely affecting, again, the global economy and all those other things. So as long as the intelligence says that there is a persistent, clear threat, then we will keep those in place.
Mm-hmm. How long is it going to be before we're not taking our liquids out of our bags anymore? No,
Yes.
that's a serious question, because you're moving towards that, right? Isn't that one of your goals?
Yeah, so one of the things we've talked about, so if you're in TSA PreCheck and you are already a known and trusted traveler, from a policy standpoint, it makes sense to me anyway that if you had a bottle of water, sealed bottle of water, that you could take that on, because that's probably not a non-metallic IED. It's probably a bottle of water. And by the way, we have nearly 1,000 what we call bottled liquid scanners at airports around the country. If we needed to, we could scan it. It's very easy to say it's water. It's more problematic to say it's one of X number of liquid explosives, or if combined with another liquid, would become not just a combustible, but an actual explosion. And so that's something we're looking at from a policy perspective. I can't give an answer to say how long it will be, because part of it is technology. Secretary Johnson and Dr. Reggie Brothers, the head of S&T, are working focused on that. It's similar to keeping shoes on, though, because now we have, everybody goes through TSA PreCheck, tens of millions of people here in the U.S. who are allowed to keep their shoes on because we assess them as being low risk for having a bomb in their shoes. Not no risk. So if somebody is acting suspiciously or something else, then we may ask somebody, and just on a random basis, you may have to take your shoes off, and they may do explosive trace detection of your hands or your shoes or something like that. So we're working toward that long term. In fact, I think we might have a slide about that, if that's where you're leading. Maybe not, but I think we do have a slide. I'd forgotten about it, but I thought that's where you're going. So I think we have a slide that talks about the past, present, and future.
Well, I don't want to turn you down on that slide.
Okay. There we go.
Okay.
Good thing somebody remembered, huh? I completely forgot. So, you can just see where we've been, that we've been talking about, if you can read that. But it basically says the past is one size fits all, limited intel and technology, which I talked about. The current is expedited security, or based on risk, flexible, agile, professional approach. That's what we're working toward. Improved passenger experience, and that you can read all those. And then the future looks at what airport checkpoints of the future will look like, at least in the U.S., and perhaps internationally, because there's a lot of interest internationally in doing things like TSA PreCheck. I know Secretary Johnson talked about pre-clearance and some of the benefits of that, and so that's one of the key enablers for expedited. And then looking at the shoes and the liquids, how can we best buy down risk while facilitating the free movement of people and goods.
Before I open it up to questions, we're a month away, almost, a little over that, from the 9/11 anniversary. You remember last year, this was a high threat period, and U.S. embassies were closed all across the Middle East. What do you see on the horizon for this anniversary?
Well, so it's not so much the anniversaries, it's just the readiness and the capabilities. And frankly, I think it comes down to the best opportunity. So anniversaries can be symbolic, but I think if there's an opportunity, actually it was early August last year, about a month before 9/11, where 22 embassies were shut down for at least a day. Sana'a, Yemen, obviously, for quite a bit longer. So I'm not as focused on the anniversaries. We're mindful, but simply on what is the current intel informing us of, and what actions do we need to take.
Are you going to take any specific actions in advance?
Not related to the 9/11 anniversary, but as related, we're already at an enhanced state with certain foreign airports that we've already talked about.
Do you see that increasing?
It all depends on the intelligence. So
is it trending that way?
It's right where it is. So, yeah.
Okay, let's have a few questions. Okay, this gentleman right here in the front. Just to tell us your name when the mic gets to you, and then give us your question.
Thank you. Steve Shapiro from Ben's. You heard about my approach earlier. If you could comment on intelligence, you have your own intelligence office. And I'm curious if that office is merely an aggregator of intelligence collected by others, such as the Bureau and CBP and places like that, or are you collectors yourselves? And do you do your own analysis, or like I asked, are you relying on others for that? So the question is the integration of your intelligence shop into the entire domestic intelligence apparatus.
Yeah, so we're not collectors in the traditional sense, although we get information about, obviously, selectees at U.S. airports and overseas, if there's anything of note that is associated with them. We do have, frankly, a great intel shop that works very closely with intel analysis out of the department. But as part of the morning community intel briefing, and then that's when my intel briefing follows up on that, I've been quite impressed and frankly surprised coming from the FBI and and obviously the great intel briefings that we had there every day. But I've been very surprised, or very pleased and surprised with the quality of analysis that TSA Intel Analysis does, also the Office of Intel Analysis, specifically related obviously to transportation, and taking information from the community as to things such as foreign fighters and access to airports and things like that, I won't go into detail, but is very helpful, not just informing our judgment and actions, but other agencies and foreign governments, because we can show things that others had not done.
So to be clear, you're aggregating and analyzing.
Yes, aggregating and analyzing. Thank you.
And just to follow up on that, when you made the security change earlier this month, was it based on a specific piece of intelligence? And if so, wait a second. But how quickly can you make that change?
Yeah.
Like you're in Washington, you get the information, and you make a call to make that change. Is it 24 hours? Is it 12 hours? Is it 6? How quickly does that happen?
Yeah, there are certain things that we can do immediately, put in place immediately, that would take several hours if it's overseas, for example, for them to kick in. So that would be the normal. If we are asking, so those are things we can do ourselves. There are other things that in asking foreign governments and carriers to do based on certain things, such as the powering up and things, that can take several days, and that's a well-coordinated effort by the U.S. government, the National Security Council particularly.
Okay, another question in the back.
Kim Dozier with CNN and the Daily Beast. So you mentioned, I believe, that there's no information right now that terrorist groups are in possession of a sophisticated missile system like the system believed to have brought down the plane over Ukraine. But you also mentioned that there are a number of airports overseas that may have a manpad threat, that have not assessed if they have a wide enough perimeter or security measures to combat that. How can Americans figure out which airports those are and avoid that threat? Would you consider publishing a list of such airports? And are you also quietly working to pressure them to make those security assessments and changes?
So obviously, we follow the State Department's travel advisories in terms of travel to any particular location, so we don't do anything independent of that. We work very closely with mitigating the risk because, for example, some airports may have a good perimeter fence, but they don't maintain it, or they don't have CCTV coverage of the fence. So somebody may go over the fence, but they don't have any way of addressing that issue. And so we actually work in several ways from a compliance standpoint, if that's what we need to do, but then in a capacity development standpoint, and working through ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and some other close allies to say, look, we have a vested interest in this airport in this country, so let's work with them, let's help them acquire the perimeter detection system that they need, or whatever it may be. So yeah, that's the way we work it. And then the chief security officers from all the major U.S. carriers have clearances, and we brief them on a regular basis, and then they make judgments and decisions on their own as to whether they want to go into a particular market or not, a particular city. So that's all something that they do.
Down here in the front.
Aaron Fuller from Computer Sciences Corporation. I have TSA Pre. It's great. And
Good.
All of us who travel, and if you have TSA Pre and you know it's great and it's speeded up the lines. Can you make a comment or two about what we don't see, and I'll say downstairs? I've had the privilege of seeing downstairs what's happening with checked baggage. So this is
Sure.
what we see visibly, but can you talk about what we don't see?
Yeah, and just for context, again, during the summer, we'll see 2 million passengers, and we'll see about 1.2 million checked bags and over 2 million carry-on bags. So that's the scope of what we deal with on a daily basis. But every checked bag goes through an explosive detection system, basically a monitor to assess are there any explosives in that checked bag. Anything that shows up as what we call a shield that we're not able to see through because it's a metal container or something, well, we will open that bag and open that metal container to see what it is shielding, because sometimes people hide things in those containers. And so every bag is assessed for explosives, just as at the checkpoint in looking at the items, because explosives are depicted in a different way as an organic rather than non-organic matter. So,
Right down over here.
2 days ago, the FAA instituted a ban on American commercial airlines flying into Ben Gurion Airport after a Hamas rocket landed about a mile away from the airport. Some in Washington wildly speculated that there were political or diplomatic motives, and the administration was very clear to deny that. My question is, now, 2 days later, the FAA has lifted that ban. What information, what gives you the confidence that the threat to Ben Gurion Airport has now been mitigated? I mean, the war's still going on, the rockets are still flying. Now the allegation is that the political pressure was to lift the ban after the Israeli government and prominent Americans asked for it. If that's not the case, then why should American airliners now think that they can fly into Ben Gurion Airport and they won't get hit by a rocket? Thank you.
yeah, so without commenting on the FAA decision, that was their decision, and so that's not TSA's lane per se. But suffice to say that each airline makes their decisions and judgments based on what they see as a risk. They are informed by the U.S. government across the community, and unless there is a ban such as FAA put on, they make those decisions. Even without a ban, airlines can make a decision to go into or not go into a particular airport. And so I think we have a combination of things here. I don't know about the political aspects, but each airline wants to buy down risk, just as, for example, FedEx and UPS, after the Yemen cargo plot, we eventually lifted that ban because of improvements that we worked with the Yemeni government to make. But UPS and FedEx and other cargo carriers make a decision on a daily basis. Do they want to go into Sana'a to pick up, or fill in the blank wherever, that they want to pick up something? Their return on investment may be so limited versus the risk that they're taking on to do that. So that's what that's all about.
Down here in the back, please. We'll have one question after this, okay.
Good morning, Craig Paraso. The World and Police and Fire Games is coming to the D.C. area next summer, and many are viewing that as a potential precursor to a successful Olympic bid for the D.C. region in 2024. So how does the potential of our hosting here in the United States these types of global events impact your thinking and your preparation?
There are so many different federal agencies, often led by the FBI, that take the lead on national security special events, and depending on who's attending Secret Service and others. We all work very closely together to make informed judgments how to buy down that risk. Obviously, state and local governments have a huge role in that, and not just fire and police, but all types of issues dealing with resiliency in case something does happen. Obviously, transit agencies that we work closely with also have a key interest in terms of buying down risk and potential vulnerabilities of transporting all these people from venue sites and things from airports and others. And so it's something that, again, the FBI typically has a lead in situations like that, but we in TSA and clearly throughout the department, I think, add value in our specific areas of responsibility.
Let's do a final question. Who's got a great question? This question's really good. Okay, over here in the back. Oh boy, now you can choose. Yeah, over in the back.
Thank you. This is a really good question. So I've spoken to some of your counterparts and your partners for a couple of years now, and they've all, J.J. Green, WTOP Radio, National Security Correspondent. And they have said to me on numerous occasions that the pace of technological change is one of the biggest threats to security. And I'd like to find out from you what your thoughts are on how technology and the pace of it changing faster and faster is impacting your ability to stay ahead of threats, to keep up with threats, and to defend.
Yeah, so we are in the challenging position of always dealing with the known threats and then trying to anticipate, whether through red teaming or through just innovative thinking, what the next threat may be. So I believe we're well positioned to deal with all the known threats, including that last underwear device a couple years ago, where a new explosive was used that our equipment and equipment around the world was not calibrated to detect. Our bomb-sniffing canines, we have almost 900 bomb-sniffing canines, have been trained and printed to detect certain types of explosives. That was not one. So it may be technology, it may be just a simple change from a terrorist standpoint. There's a number of technologists here in the room, and we work very closely with many to say, yes, we're interested in the best detection capabilities for the knowns, but what do you see as the unknowns? And spiral development is always good. I'm always looking for that next generation detection, but a breakthrough technology is also welcome for anybody who can do that to, again, just help us buy down risk in the best measured way possible.
Okay, well, that pretty much does it. I'd like to give you the last word, though, John.
Well, again, I just appreciate the opportunity to be here. Your support, several people have said you have a thankless job. It's not thankless. I appreciate the support as we continue making changes. When you go through TSA checkpoints, if the security officers have done a good job, if you would tell them thanks, that goes a long way. We just did a small pay raise. Secretary Johnson just approved a small pay raise for our frontline workforce, first one in 6 years that they'd had just across the board. So it is something that it's great technology, but we are working to do everything we can to professionalize the workforce, and that positive feedback is good. And I'd like just to give a shout out to my wife, Kathy Harp. We celebrate our 35th anniversary on Monday, so with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.